Dr. Chari Smith is one of those OBGYNs that you tell your friends about, and I have indeed done that. She's competent, caring, and loaded with the character that every patient looks for in her doctor. She practices with Novant Health, Prince William County OBGYN in Manassas and Haymarket. She is a married woman of great faith and a new mom to a beautiful baby girl. And with all that, she's still determined to go the distance with us again this year. Put some love in the chat for Dr. Chari Smith.
Have enjoyed what we have had thus far. I mean, there's so many nuggets and so many gems to kind of help us with our, just keeping our mind together. And I know that sounds crazy, but that's what I mean. Just, we have to focus on ourselves to help keep our mind together. I wanted to change it a little bit because we've mostly been talking about clinical depression, anxiety, clinical disorders. And I'm going to put a little bit of a different spin on that. I wanted to speak briefly about how hormonal changes occur in all women, and how those changes impact her cognitive and mental health as she travels through life. So basically what I'm talking about is just everyday living, everyday women, mental kind of changes. It does impact mental illness and mental health. So we'll kind of tie that all in together. So as we've talked about already, depression is one of the leading causes of disease-related disabilities in women. Women are nearly twice as likely as men to suffer from an episode of depression. Of course, one of the major differences between men and women is the presence of ovaries. And of course, what ovaries secrete. So yes, we're going to talk about hormones. So prior to puberty, the incidence of depression, and after menopause, the incidence of depression is equal in men and women. So there's this window of time. I've read a few different places between puberty and menopause, that's called the window of vulnerability. I feel some kind of way about that because it makes it feel like that's a time where it's bad. And we know that we are created and perfectly. So it kind of alludes to the fact that hormones are bad, but we'll talk a little bit about what this all means. So there are 3 questions that I'm going to ask over and over and over again. I'm going to probably insult your intelligence. I'm going to be redundant. So just please forgive me. But the 3 questions that we're going to ask with each phase. So we're going to just kind of journey through life. So we're going to start at puberty, talk a little bit about periods, PMS, pregnancy, and the postpartum period, and menopause, perimenopause, postmenopause, all those confusing terms. So the question that we're going to have, the questions that we're going to ask ourselves is, first, what is the definition? Second, what is happening? And third, how is it going to make me feel? So let's start with puberty. So the definition of puberty, of course, is the term that is used for the transition from sexual immaturity to sexual maturity. So, you know, what is happening during this period of time? So you've got little girls, they've got our brains. There is a hormone called luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone, and their little brains start to secrete that. That hormone goes and it, you know, stimulates their little 8-9-year-old ovaries. And those ovaries start to secrete a little estrogen. So the estrogen kind of comes into the bloodstream and little girls start developing breasts and hair in different places and skeletal growth. They start having growth spurts. And this is the most important thing. All of this just doesn't happen overnight. So it starts like 8 or 9, and the whole process of sexual maturation to become the women that you're going to become, that starts with puberty, it really kind of expands. It stretches over several years. So 15, 16, 18, 19. This is important to remember when we talk about menopause. So estrogen is secreted, the ovaries are kind of doing their thing. And the next stage is menarche. So of course, gonna, totally insult your intelligence, but menarche is the very first period. So that's when we now have cyclical changes that are occurring. And how does that play into the young girl? So now, once you go to puberty, the incidence of depression, and so prior to puberty, equal. And, of course, it's sad when you have little children that have depression, but prior to puberty, equal. Once you go to puberty, girls are twice as likely to have depression than little boys in puberty. So the question is, why does that happen? It must be hormones, right? Because that's the difference between the two. And I was shocked to find that it's not hormones. I thought that it was because of the estrogen and progesterone and the cyclical changes. And that has been proven to not be the case. That the reason why there's a higher incidence in depression in girls, puberty, adolescence, is because of how they deal with the changes that occur. So it's kind of indirect. So the changes that are occurring hormonally. So now we're developing how you handle all of those changes. Those are the things that increase the risk for depression. So there are self-esteem issues, body kind of awareness issues. If you develop earlier, so young girls who develop earlier, they have a higher incidence of depression because they're dealing with all these body changes that maybe say their peer is not. So a lot of it is what's going on with my friend over here, what's going on with my peer group. How am I supported? So this is when it's important as mothers and as grandmothers and aunts, cousins, friends. This is the time where you embrace these young women and you empower them and you help them to love their bodies and also help to encourage them to not look at other people. So the incident, the very interesting situation in this part of a woman's life or a girl's life is that there are racial differences. So Black girls don't have as high of an incidence of depression as, say, white girls. So, there are some kind of racial changes or racial differences, but the main cause of depression in girls who are going through puberty is that self-esteem, that developing, how you're handling the maturation process. I wanted to kind of throw a little bit in the cognitive changes because this is important because there are some kind of overlaps with mental changes. So there is a portion of the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That is the impulse control part of the brain. That is the last part or one of the last parts of the brain that develops. So you have these individuals that have great cognitive, they're smart and they're beautiful and they're athletic, but they still have that little part in their brain, that impulse control part that is not fully developed. And this is the reason why you have what we call hot cognition and cool cognition. So this is the reason why you talk to your adolescent, right? And you think everything is good. And then next thing you know, they flip the switch and fly off the handle and are crying. And it's like, World War III. And it's not because we always want to blame that on the hormones. And it's important for us to not blame it on the hormones because boys have this as well. They don't have that ability. They're not mature. That prefrontal cortex, that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is not mature. So it doesn't allow them to be able to rein those emotions in. So the impulse control is not there. So impulse control kind of ties into mental health, our decisions, what we do, who we hang out with. Those are things that affect our mental well-being and our cognition. So it was important for me to tell you about that. So we talked a little bit about how that makes you feel. All right, so moving right along. So now we have our periods. So now we talk about the fun things that we kind of always, you hear people talking about: premenstrual syndrome, premenstrual dysphoria disorder, These are mental conditions. They have a lot of other symptoms that go along with it. So what is it? What's the definition? Premenstrual syndrome, the definition of premenstrual syndrome: cyclic physical and behavioral symptoms that appear in the days preceding menses. What is premenstrual dysphoria disorder, or dysphoric disorder? Sorry, pardon me. It is a severe form of premenstrual syndrome characterized by prominent symptoms of irritability, anger, internal tension, dysphoria. Okay, so commercial break. What is dysphoria? So dysphoria is that sense of uneasiness, like that sense of generalized dissatisfaction with life. So that is one of the symptoms of this premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So you have the internal tension, dysphoria, and you have mood lability, kind of ups and downs. So these potentially have a hormonal component to it. So what is happening? So what is happening is that the brain is secreting the follicular stimulating hormone. We talked about this with our little puberty girls. The ovaries are making follicles. So follicles, AKA cysts, AKA where the egg is growing. That egg is growing. As it's growing, it's kicking out estrogen, it's making that uterus get ready for the baby. And I'm totally insulting your intelligence, but we're gonna go through it again. Making that uterus nice and ready for a baby. The estrogen levels get to a certain point. The brain says, all right, the egg is ready. That's cause ovulation. And so there is a hormone called luteinizing hormone, and you have the LH surge. This LH surge is very important when we're talking about mental issues. So the LH surge, ovulation, it secretes progesterone, which is a hormone that has some mood capabilities, feeling good. It is a steroid hormone. It also secretes GABA, it secretes serotonin, and it secretes opioids. So that LH surge, those are neurotransmitters. So GABA, what is GABA? Well, GABA is the calming neurotransmitter. And serotonin is the kind of feel good, kind of emotionally stable, happy neurotransmitter. And opioid, of course, we know opioid, that's the one that's excitement and euphoria. So these are all stimulated with ovulation. Isn't God good? So right before you're trying to make a baby, you're feeling good. So that's how we are created, right? So what is happening? How is this making us feel? Well, how does that tie into PMS or PMDD? So it's not directly a problem with hormones. At least this is what we think. There's so many things we don't know, but we do know that it's not because you got too much estrogen or not enough progesterone, and these are the things you hear all the time. The thought is that there's not enough of the feel good neurotransmitters. So maybe when you have ovulation, maybe you're not secreting as much as GABA. Maybe I don't make as much GABA as my sister over here makes, or maybe my serotonin levels are not as high. Just intrinsically, what makes me who I am, maybe I'm not making as much. That's one potential theory. Maybe I make enough GABA, but for whatever reason, I don't detect it. I don't have the normal response to it. So that's the reason why we use medications like Zoloft. So Zoloft is a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, right? Serotonin, that's the word we used. So sometimes for patients who have PMS, we use a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It makes more levels of serotonin to circulate, and that's what makes you feel a little bit better around your period. So how that makes us feel, if we don't have all these things that are working the way they're supposed to work, then you get the PMDD. So you get that irritability, you get that anger, you get that internal tension, that dysphoria, and all of that stays prominent that period of time before you have your period, when the hormone levels drop back down. So that's about that 10 to 12 days before menses. So this is natural, everyday things that are occurring. And the important thing is you can have all of this and you can also still have clinical depression. So you can have a baseline of depression and it could be significantly exacerbated with your hormones, or you could have no clinical depression, but you can have these features that 10 days out of the month, you have these kind of feelings of hopelessness and uneasiness and dissatisfaction. So that is the reason why I wanted to talk to you about it, because it's important for us to understand what's happening with our bodies and what's kind of a part of the normal process. No, you don't have clinical depression, because we talked about what is the definition of, what's the criteria for you to have clinical depression, where you absolutely need to be on something or you have depression every single day of the month. That is not these people. So moving to the next phase. Okay, so you're having periods. What's the next thing that happens? You get pregnant, right? So I'm totally going to insult your intelligence again. So what is the definition of pregnancy? Well, that's the period in which the fetus, of course, is growing in the uterus, developing in the uterus. So there's no ovulation that's happening now. So there's no estrogen, there's no progesterone. There is estrogen and progesterone, but differently. You're not ovulating, you're not having those ups and downs, you're not having an LH surge, you're not having PMS, you're not having PMDD, you're not having all of those changes because the ovaries are quiet, because they're not needed, because the baby is developing on the inside of the uterus. So what is the source of intrapartum or antenatal or pregnancy depression? And then what is the source of postpartum depression, right? So that's kind of what the next thing. So what is the postpartum period? That's the definition of that, of course, is the time of rapid readjustment to the non-pregnant state. So what is happening? So this is the part that is not well understood. And it's a really big issue, because pregnancy depression and postpartum depression is a really, really big. I have some incidences here. Postpartum depression, 30% of women experience postpartum depression. Postpartum blues, which is a part of some of the changes that occurs, 50 to 75% of women have postpartum blues. And that's prolonged bouts of crying and sadness and anxiety. Usually it's within that first 2 weeks after the baby is born. Postpartum depression can last almost up to a year. So what is happening in our bodies that's making us more vulnerable to these things? So one is our external influences. So African-American women, Black women have the highest incidence of postpartum depression. Some of that is our social kind of impacts, what's going on around us. So when you look at what causes depression in these women, you have to consider genetics, you have to consider finances, you have to consider what's going on in their lives, you have to consider family history, you have to consider pregnancy history. One of our earlier speakers talked about giving birth to a stillborn. That is going to impact your next pregnancy, and that can increase your risk for having intrapartum or pregnancy depression. And these are things that are not hormonal, but these are things that happen in your life. So it's important for us to have an understanding about what are the risk factors. So one of the main things that I was able to determine or see that causes depression during pregnancy is the placenta. So the placenta is secreting this hormone called cortisol releasing hormone. So CRH, we're going to call it CRH. So that the placenta, those high levels of cortisol releasing hormone, they cross the placenta and they cross into the fetus. So the placenta is separate, of course, than the fetus, but it's all a part of the fetus. So the placenta is making the CRH. It is stimulating the fetus and causing the fetus's little adrenal gland to increase cortisol levels, and that causes lung maturation. The CRH is also stimulating the uterus, and that causes contractions. The problem is that the high levels of CRH in some people can increase the risk of depression. So all of these great things that help with keeping your baby sustained and getting ready to come out, and also the onset of contraction, the onset of labor, can also cause the increase of CRH in the maternal bloodstream. And there's a possibility that that can impact the mental health. And that hormone stays around even after the baby is born. It takes some time for that to kind of dissipate. So that's the reason why you still see it even in the postpartum period. So there are some other things that we don't have enough time to go through, things with the hypothalamus in the brain, inflammatory responses. The other most important thing that I wanted to say about pregnancy and how that affects what's happening in our bodies and how that affects our mental health is it increases the incidence of inflammatory changes of the thyroid. And we know that thyroid disease increases the risk of mental illness or mental disorders. So it all is kind of tied in together, and it's important for us to understand. Okay, so I'm zipping through everything. So, you know, I get excited. I got all these things I want to say, and I don't have enough time. So maybe one time I can just talk on one thing. But so the next phase, done having babies, now we're talking about menopause and perimenopause. So this is one of the things that I have a little bit of a bone to pick, because I have patients that come in all the time and say, my hormones are off the chain. I have all this anxiety and depression. And the literature states that menopause is not a cause for depression and anxiety. It's not the hormones. But let's talk a little bit about this. Let's get the definitions. Let me go back to my questions. I fell off script there. So what is the definition? So menopause is the point in time. Menopause is the point in time where your period stops. So it's the last period. So we talked about our puberty girls, menarche, that's the first period. Last period is menopause, right? So the period of time leading up to menopause is perimenopause. So that's the period of time where you're still ovulating, but you're having changes that are occurring with your ovaries and your body that is leading up to the actual act of not having periods anymore. So perimenopause, we hear that you have irregular periods sometimes. Sometimes you have some of the symptoms that go with after you at postmenopause. We use menopause and postmenopause interchangeably, but the real true definition is you should use the word postmenopause. Things like hot flashes and night sweats and vaginal dryness, those things occur after the act of menopause. So we have perimenopause, the period of time getting up to menopause, and then we have menopause, and then we have postmenopause, right? So what is going on? So the thought is that it's the estrogen is depleted, and that's the reason why my computer's doing something weird here. So that's the reason why we're having all of these awful, god-awful mood swings. And so the thought is that that's not what's happening. So the thought is that perhaps maybe, so this is the one thing that I thought was really important. So the middle-aged women, menopausal women, they do not have a higher incidence of depression when you compare it to the rest of all other women. They actually have a lower incidence of depression. But there's mental things that are changing, I guess we're changing mentally from hormonal changes. And that sounded crazy, but basically, what is happening is that this is a period of life where there's a lot of things going on in women's lives. So there are a lot of changes going on. So you have natural aging that's occurring. You also have the lack of hormones, and the big thing that impacts your mental health are vasomotor symptoms and inability to sleep. So this is what the experts are saying. The experts are saying that it's not necessarily the actual cessation or decrease of estrogen that's making you have this anxiety and depression. It's the other symptoms that are preventing you from having a good quality of life, that are increasing your risk for mental illness. So case in point, you're having hot flashes all through the night. You're not getting a good night's rest. You have a whole week of waking up, sweating, throwing the covers off, taking them back on, throwing them off. You're having insomnia. Your brain is not having that ability to get a good recuperative night's rest. So they're saying is because of some of these things, these are increasing the risk for mental disorders, mental illness. They do say that women who have women who have PMS, when they're menstruating, had really bad PMS, they have a higher incidence of depression during the menopausal years. So there are some kind of crossover. There is some crossover, but it is not acceptable to say, oh, you're having depression because your hormones are low. No, that's not quite right. We have a lot of things going on. This is also the time in a woman's life where you have parents that you're taking care of, and you have children that you're taking care of. You may even be having grandchildren that you're taking care of. You're having your own job. You're still working with your career. You are having changes with your body. You're having hot flashes. You're not getting a good night's rest. So all of that together, from what the experts are saying, those are the things that negatively impact our day-to-day mental health. So I just wanted to kind of give you just a smattering of what happens in a woman's life. Of course, it would be great if I could talk more about each individual one, but I don't have all day, and I don't want to suck up the rest of the conference time. But it was important for me to share this. So yeah, that's what we have. And if there are any other questions, I guess, we can go through with Naglitha, and we can kind of address or unpack some other specific things. So that's what we have.
Back. Okay, I am back. I am back. First of all, thank you, Dr. Chari. Let's see. I think we're gonna do a little split screen thing there. Okay, hold on one second, Dr. Chari. Hold on. Okay, there we are. You are such the consummate educator. I put that in the chat. And Chari was with us last year. Each year I give her about 15 things to talk about. I know you'd be like, could I just talk about one thing? No, absolutely not. No, I'm just joking. Maybe next year. But I so appreciate the way you just have broken things down for us. And as women, there are many things that we think we know, but we don't necessarily know how they connect to other things. Mm-hmm. I have a page full of notes that you and I have to talk about offline. So let me just hit some of the questions. Wow. Let me just start. I have two sisters that have asked about the connection. Let's see, with the thyroid. So let's see. Ann Hill says, can you quickly explain the thyroid inflammation to depression, the thyroid situation you mentioned, and how it increases possibly the possibility of depression?
Yeah, so I did talk about how the thyroid, how that impacts as far as during the postpartum period. But the thyroid, of course, is the thermostat of the body. It regulates several processes in the body. So the thyroid is also plays a key role in our mood, our mental health, our mood. So that's one of the reasons why when you go to the doctor and you say, hey, I'm feeling depressed or I'm feeling anxious, one of the first blood tests that we check is your thyroid, because if your thyroid is abnormal, if you're hyperthyroid, you can have anxiety. If you're underactive thyroid, you can have depression, and that could be manifested as lethargy or just not the desire to do the things that you like to do, weight gain, and all of those kind of sound like depression, but they could be that you have an underactive thyroid. So kind of that's how it kind of ties in together.
Ties in. Got you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Like I said, we had a couple of sisters who were interested in what that connection was. Let's see. Susan Rand said, I've dealt with insomnia for years, and the effect on my body and mind has worsened as I've aged. Yeah, I hear you. Natasha Kuntz Webster, my cousin, said, so informative. Thank you, Dr. Chari. Let's see, my other questions real quickly. One sister asked the question, can you get pregnant during perimenopause?
Yes. Yes, you're still
Okay.
ovulating. Yeah, so you need, if that's not in the plan, you need contraception.
I hear
But yeah,
you. I hear
you
you.
can still, I read something last night that there is, the oldest documented person is 59, which is
Okay.
ridiculous. But this woman was still ovulating, just not regularly. So, oh, that's what I wanted to say. So
Okay.
just like we talked about with puberty, how it takes over a long period of time, menopause is the same. So you start, you start with breast development, when you're growing up, you breast development and all the other things, and then your period comes, and then the period, you start to kind of continue to mature. The same holds true with menopause. So the hormone levels are waning, your periods are not as regular, you stop your period, menopause, right? But you're still progressing on that journey. So that's the reason why your hot flashes start getting worse, and perhaps maybe skin changes are worsening, because it's like a dimmer switch. The ovaries are still kind of waning. So this can happen, start as early as 45, 46, and you can be deep into your 50s, almost 60s for, before you, officially proclaim, I am done. So.
Yeah. Wow. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so many women think sometimes like at 50 that there's something magic about 50. My cycle will stop at 50. And then there are others, they look up and it's like, I'm 55 and it's still going, and I'm 56 and it's still going. So thank you for that. In terms of age, one of the sisters asked the question, yeah. Dale Savage said, my granny called the menopause baby the change baby. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know your granny, right? Someone says, what is the normal range for the start of the normal age for the start of the period?
Oh, the normal age. So it has changed a little bit. So the average age to start for menarche is around 9 to 11. 9 to 11. So there's it used to be a little bit later. So like 12, 13, but now it's around 9 to 11 is that kind of sweet spot. 10, 11, 12. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So 9 to 11 is now what they said. They changed it, and I don't know why it's changed, other than I don't know if our society and how things are changing. But 9 to 11 is around the time where you have menarche. It can last up to 12. I have some patients that still haven't had menarche. It's the exception, not the rule. They still don't have menarche 15, 16, 17, but typically is that kind of that 9 to 12. We'll just say 9 to 12 if we want to kind of include both the current and the older kind of guidelines.
Both. Okay. Understand. There are many questions. Oh my gosh. Hot flashes, hormones in meat. Are there classes offered on these topics? So you have your work cut out for you, Dr. Chari, here in the chat. I'm going to turn you over to the chat. If you would just, do what you can in terms of responses. And I encourage everyone, if possible, just go see you. You know what I mean? Just you become the doctor for us all.
You can definitely talk to your gynecologist about the changes that are occurring, and make a special appointment, like just a consultation appointment, just to talk about this one thing. This is not the conversation to have tied on to your well woman exam or some other kind of because it takes a long time. But the most important thing is for us to understand mentally, why do we feel the way we feel mentally? And some of it is that there is a clinical depression, but some of it is changes that are occurring in our bodies. So it's important for you to have an understanding about what's happening, so you know how to fix it and how to address it. So that was the reason why this was not meant to be a menopause talk.
Yeah,
that's the reason why I wanted to kind of bring it up, so that you have an understanding about what's going on mentally.
Dr. Chari, as always, thank you. Just going to put us down for next year, September 23rd, 2022.